Hi everyone! This lesson will be about semi-logical functions. Semi-logical functions evaluate a cell to see if it meets a certain criteria and then perform an action. We'll be looking at 6 semi-logical functions in this lesson. We will do a COUNTIF, a SUMIF, and an AVERAGEIF. COUNTIF and SUMIF are available in both Office 2003 and Office 2007. AVERAGEIF is only available in Office 2007. 3 more functions we'll look at that are only available in Office 2007 are COUNTIFS, SUMIFS, and AVERAGEIFs. These 3 allow you to do a count, sum, or average based on more than one criteria. Let's look at 3 examples before we start with our data. The first semi-logical function we will do is a COUNTIF. A COUNTIF will count a cell if it meets a criteria. In this case, we'll look at a salesperson and the amount that they've sold. We're going to count if the salesperson is Jane. Each time Jane appears in the salesperson column, 1 will be added. So the result of our COUNTIF in this example would be 4. In our next example, we'll do a SUMIF. In this case, we're going to sum the amount in the amount column if the salesperson is Jane. So each time Jane appears in the salesperson column, her sales amount will be added. So our result for the SUMIF will be 3,317. For our last example, before we look at Excel data, we'll look at what an AVERAGEIF does. In this AVERAGEIF, we're going to average the amount in the amount column if the salesperson is Jane. Each time Jane appears in the salesperson column, her amount will be set aside, added, divided by the count, and then we'll have an average. Now let's practice in Excel. First, let's look at our data. Here we have a company name, an industry, an exchange code, their sales figures, the cost of sales, gross margin, and gross margin percentage. At the top we have questions. We're going to evaluate this data to see how many securities brokerages we have, our total sales for securities brokerages, total sales for companies with a gross margin percentage greater than 75%, average sales for the machinery industry, how many NYS banks we have, total sales for NYS banks, and average sales for NYS banks. So if we wanted to count how many securities brokerages there are, we could look in the industry column, scroll down, and count how many times we see securities brokerage. But that seems like a real waste of time. Instead, we'll use the COUNTIF function. So we'll start by in cell C3 typing equals COUNTIF and opening parentheses. Now notice in the screen tip below the cell, the first thing it asks for, the first argument, is range. Range is bold right now. That shows us that that's the argument we're on in the formula. Now our range will be the place where we look for our criteria. So our range is going to be the industry column. Now in this tutorial, I'm going to use keyboard shortcuts to do my functions. You are welcome to use the mouse if you want to, but I'll teach you how to use keyboard shortcuts to do functions. I'll just use the down arrow on my keyboard to arrow down to the first cell in my range. Then, to select the entire range, I'm going to use a keyboard shortcut. I'm going to use Control-Shift down arrow. So I'm going to hold down Control and Shift and press the down arrow on the keyboard. And that has selected my entire continuous range. I'm going to type a comma to move on to the next argument in our function, which is criteria. Our criteria is securities brokerage because we're looking for securities brokerages. Now, your criteria has to be in quotes. So I'm going to open my quotes and type securities brokerage. And close my quotes. Your criteria is not case sensitive, but it does have to be spelled correctly. Now to finish my formula, I'll close my parentheses and hit the enter key on my keyboard. Now if I scroll up a bit, you can see we have 8 securities brokerages in our data. So that's a COUNTIF. Now let's say we want to see what the total sales for all of the securities brokerages are. For this, we'll use a SUMIF formula. The SUMIF formula will evaluate the industry column, see if a company is a securities brokerage. It will take the sales and put that aside and total the sales for each securities brokerage. So to do our SUMIF, we'll start with the equal sign and type SUMIF and open parentheses. Our range is the place we're looking for our criteria. Because our criteria is securities brokerage, we will select the industry column as our range again. So I'm using the down arrow key to arrow to the first cell in the industry column. I'm going to use the Control-Shift down arrow keyboard shortcut to select the industry column. Now to move on to the next part of my formula, I'm going to just type a comma, and you can see now in the screen tip, criteria is bolded. That shows me I'm on the criteria portion of the formula. Just like in the last formula, our criteria is securities brokerage. So in quotes, I'm going to type securities brokerage and close my quotes. Now I'm going to type a comma to move on to the last portion of my formula. This is the sum range. And the sum range is asking us what do we want to sum if the criteria is met, and we want to sum the sales if the criteria is met. So we're going to select the sales column. Now, even though it looks like we're in the bottom of our worksheet, I'm actually going to use the down arrow key to arrow to the sales column. And that's because even though we're looking towards the bottom of our worksheet, we're still up in that cell C5. So I'm going to press the down arrow on my keyboard. You can see that it moved me back up to the top. And I'm going to arrow down and then over to the right to select my sales column. I'm in the first cell of the sales column, and I'll do Control-Shift down arrow to select it. Now I'll close my parentheses and hit enter and arrow up to see my total sales. So that's one SUMIF using text as my criteria. Let's look at a SUMIF where we're using numbers for our criteria. So we want to know the total sales for companies who have a gross margin percentage greater than 75%. So for this formula, again, we're doing a SUMIF. So I'll type equals SUMIF. Notice that as I type, Excel shows me formulas below that start with those letters. If you want to select from the formulas shown below, you use your arrow keys to select the one that you want, and then press the tab key on your keyboard, and that will finish entering your formula and open your parentheses for you. So I've got equals SUMIF, and I've opened my parentheses. Now my range is where I'm looking for my criteria. In this case, my criteria is a gross margin percentage greater than 75%. So my range will be my gross margin percentage column. I'm going to use the down arrow key to arrow down, and then the right arrow key to arrow to the right until I get to the first cell in the gross margin percentage column. Now I'm going to press Control-Shift down arrow on my keyboard, and I've selected my range. I'll type a comma, and then I enter my criteria. My criteria is greater than 75%. I actually have to put that in quotes as well, just like we did with securities brokerage when that was our criteria. So I open my quotes, I'm going to type the greater than symbol, and then type 75%. If you want to, you can type the percentage as a decimal. You could type 0.75 and it would give you the same results. I'm going to type a comma to move on to the next part of my formula, which is my sum range. Just like in the last formula, our sum range is the sales column because we're looking for the total sales. So even though we're looking at the bottom of our worksheet, we'll use the down arrow key to move down, and then we'll use the right key to move to the right to select the sales column. Now Control-Shift down arrow to select the entire column. I'll close my parentheses and hit the Enter key. And now I have my total sales for companies with a gross margin percentage greater than 75%. Now we're coming to a formula that is not available in 2003, but AVERAGEIF, it's new to 2007. So we'd like to look at the average sales for companies whose industry is machinery. We'll start with an equal sign and type AVERAGEIF, and I will use the down arrow key to move down to AVERAGEIF in the box below and hit the tab key to select it. Now my range is where I'm looking for my criteria. That's going to be industry. So I'm using the down arrow key to arrow down to industry. Control-Shift down arrow to select the industry column. And I'll type a comma to move on to the next portion of my formula. And we can see from the screen tip that our next portion is our criteria. The criteria is that it needs to be machinery. So in quotes, we'll type machinery, close the quotes, and then type a comma. Our average range, we're looking to average the sales, so we'll select the sales column. I'm going to use the down arrow key. It takes me back up to the top of my worksheet, and then I'll arrow over to the sales column. From the first cell in the sales column, I'll select Control-Shift down arrow to select my range, close my parentheses, and hit the Enter key. Now if I arrow up a bit, I can see what the average sales for machinery are. Now let's look at some semi-logical functions that allow us to have more than one criteria. These three functions are all new to Office 2007. The first is COUNTIFS, and we'll start it by putting in equals COUNTIFS. I'm going to arrow down to COUNTIFS in the box and select and hit the tab key. Now we're looking to see how many banks we have that have an NYS exchange code. So to do this, we will arrow down to the industry column where one of our criteria is, and we'll use Control-Shift down arrow to select it. We'll type a comma, and here we put in our first criteria. Our First criteria is that it has to be a bank. We'll put bank in quotes and then type a comma to move on to the next criteria. Our other criteria is that it be an NYS exchange code. So I'm going to arrow down and then arrow one to the right until I get to the exchange code column. Control Shift down arrow to select the column, and I'll type a comma. Now I put in my second criteria, which is that the cell contain NYS. And again, that needs to be in quotes. We'll close the parentheses and hit enter. So we have 16 banks with an NYS exchange code. Now let's look at the total sales for NYS banks. So since we're looking for the total sales, we're going to do a SUMIFS. SUMIFS allows us to sum based on more than one criteria. So we'll start with equals, SUMIFS. Now notice this time, instead of putting our criteria first, it actually asks for the sum range first. So we're going to sum the sales, so we'll arrow down to our sales column and select the entire sales column by using Control Shift down arrow, and then type a comma. Our criteria range is where we're looking for our criteria. So the first criteria is that it be a bank. I'll use the down arrow key to move to the industry column and Control Shift down arrow to select the industry column where we're looking for the criteria. I'll type a comma to move on to the next part of the formula, which is where I put in my first criteria. My first criteria is that it be a bank. So I'll open the quotes, type bank, type it correctly, close the quotes, and type a comma. Now it's asking for criteria range 2, the range for our second criteria. So I'm going to use the down arrow key to arrow down and then over one to the exchange code column, because our second criteria is that the exchange code be NYS. I'll use Control Shift down arrow to select the column. I'll type a comma to move on to my criteria. And my criteria is that the exchange code column contain NYS. So in quotes, I'll type NYS. It doesn't actually have to be capitalized. It's not case sensitive. And I'll close my parentheses now. I'm finished with my formula. I'll hit the Enter key, arrow up. This is the total sales for NYS banks. Now, with our AVERAGEIFS formula, we'll evaluate what the average sales for NYS banks are. So I'll start with equals, AVERAGEIFS. I'll select it from the menu and hit the Tab key. Now, again, instead of having the average range at the end of our formula, our average range is the first thing that we enter before our criteria. We're averaging the sales for NYS banks, so we'll select the sales column, arrow down, and then to the right until you get to the first cell in the sales column. Select Control Shift down arrow on your keyboard to select that as your average range. Then type a comma. Now our criteria range 1 will be industry because we want to make sure that industry is bank. So use the down arrow key to arrow to the first cell in the industry column, Control Shift down arrow to select the industry column, then type a comma. Open quotes And we'll enter our criteria for the industry column, and that is bank. Be sure to close your quotes, then type a comma. And our second criteria is that the exchange code be NYS. So our criteria range will be the exchange code column. Arrow down to the first cell in the exchange code column, then use Control-Shift down arrow on your keyboard to select it. Now that we've selected the criteria range, we'll type a comma to move on to the next part of our formula, which is criteria 2. Criteria 2 is that it be NYS. So open quotes, type NYS, close the quotes, and then close your parentheses on the formula. Hit the Enter key. We'll arrow up to see the results. You can see this is the average sales for NYS banks. This was an introduction to semi-logical functions. Thank you for watching.